Now, you said in one interview that gay liberation was rather like Northern Ireland, that once the troubles are over, there's a different story to tell.
Yes, and I think it's always a mistake to think that just because the conflict in Northern Ireland ended, there would not be poetry in Northern Ireland, or there would not be fiction from Northern Ireland, or drama from Northern Ireland. It would be, perhaps be a new sort of drama. And I think it's the same with sort of post-liberation gay writers. That I think of a novel like Alan Hollinghurst's The Spell, which doesn't occur to anyone in the novel that there's a problem with being gay, but they think there's a problem with getting older. And I thought with, say, that novel, or with Edmund White's Even the Married Man, that you're back to Jane Austen. What happens if two people are together and they're not quite right for each other as far as the world is concerned? In Jane Austen, that Mr. Darcy is rich, for example, and our heroine is not. In these novels, that the guy's a bit older, and you know the object of desire is very young and beautiful, and how will they get together? And the reader longs for them to get together, so that you can so the gay romance, you know, is, I mean, in a novel like The Spell or Ed White's The Married Man, is still absolutely there, and indeed in your own work is still there to be written without that background of darkness, or you know, so that there's still stories, and stories won't go away.
Now, moving on to The Master, your great novel about Henry James, my own experience is that pre-modern stories of queerness, as it were, in some ways are very rich because it's all less labelled, less neatly categorised. Did you find that?
I suppose that gay history is not like Jewish history or Irish history, in that there's a dotted line rather than a direct line to the past. And it's really unclear what Edwardians were up to, or Victorians. Sometimes you feel that all of them were having the most wonderful time, that, you know, there are times on trains, in hotels, with servants. You just can't tell what they were doing. I mean, you know, you learn a funny little fact, like the gondoliers in Venice were up for anything in those years. And you say, wow, but James spent his time going around Venice with gondoliers. Is it possible that just everybody knew and didn't know, and that the idea of James as a virgin, for example, is just rubbish? But whatever was happening, there was great reticence. He burned an awful lot of letters. He burned an awful lot of material. But as he got older, especially in his 50s and 60s, he wrote letters to younger men, which are unmistakable. And the levels of desire are almost expressed in those letters. So I became interested in this idea that in his 20s in Paris, he had known a number of men. But once he went to London, he stopped. And in his 30s and 40s, he just worked and knew a lot of duchesses. But in his 50s, a sort of loneliness descended, and in other words, he blocked the stream. But then it's terribly interesting to watch how the stream continued to flow, and how that emerged, sometimes in great loneliness, but sometimes also in a number of relationships that meant a lot to him, and that perhaps much more happened in, both emotionally and physically, than any of us could guess. So I was interested in that business of how little we know and how much we can guess.
And there's such a double standard, isn't there, that we always assume that a man and woman in the past who so much as went for a walk together were at it like rabbits. Whereas when you're hypothesizing any kind of same-sex relationship in the past, people always say, what hard proof have you?
Yes, and then you can almost work like in, for example, women's history. You have to do an awful lot of sort of micro work, where a tiny little moment has to stand for an awful lot. That if you were writing a history, say, of women in the Irish Revolutionary period, where they weren't imprisoned, they weren't executed, they didn't write letters, They didn't write manifestos. But yet and yet and yet, if you do the work properly, and women's history has become immensely important in this way, you can actually find out an awful lot